Hey guys, this is Cullen Moshman for CardsChat.com, and we are continuing on right now with me and Katie's course, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days. And the topic of day 16 is hand planning, which we're going to call Thinking Like a Chess Master, continuing with the analogy from the book. Now obviously what the top chess players are doing is going to be more complicated than we might need at a low stakes poker, but we can at least follow the chess example to the extent that we ask ourselves important questions like, what's our opponent likely to do next? How are we going to respond to that? How is this hand going to play out? And then taking proactive steps to make it happen that way. Now, one thing we didn't talk about quite as much in the book, but I want to address here is pre-flop hand planning. And that's an important concept too. So for example, let's say that we open with a 100 blind stack, and that's the effective stack because somebody covers us, but there are several short stacks left to act. So we want to think, well, what are we going to do if they shove over my raise? And if you have a few aggressive short stacks left to act, and you would have to fold your hand like Jack-9 suited if any of them shoved, then maybe you shouldn't open to begin with, and that's an important question to ask yourself. Or another question is if you 3-bet, so you re-raise before the flop, a common thing people are going to do at a lot of stack depths is if they continue on in the hand, they're going to shove on you. So if you really don't want to call off that shove and you really don't want to fold, which might be the case depending on the situation with a hand like ace-queen, then what are you going to do? And if you don't like any of your options, then it's usually going to be best to just call instead of make the 3-bet. And that's how this kind of thought process is directly actionable. So again, from the book, there's this really important idea of how many bets. And so post-flop, if you have nothing, then you can still plan your hand. You can still think, okay, well, am I going to bluff? And if so, what turn and river cards am I going to continue the bluff with? But for the most part, this framework of how many bets is going to be when you have at least some kind of post-flop showdown value. So maybe you have ace high on queen 7 deuce flop, and the answer is no bets. You want to show down, but your hand just isn't good enough to put in any bets. Maybe you can bluff catch one street. And then the other extreme is you have a very strong hand and you just want as many bets as possible to go in. And there are a few factors this is going to depend on. So the first one is position. And the way that that affects things is you usually want to go after more bets with a late position dynamic because ranges are wider. So let's say, for example, you limp in the small blind and you hit a weak top pair hand. Well, that's a pretty strong hand actually in the context of blind versus blind play, and you can usually go after a full 3 streets of value minimum with any top pair hand. Whereas if you raise under the gun, people are going to put you on a tighter range. So if all you connect with is a weak top pair, then you probably can't even go after the full 3 bets. So we'll look at more examples of that later on in this video when we get to the specific hands, but position is really important. Also, the looser and more calling station oriented your opponents are, the more bets you can go after compared to a tighter player who's only going to give you action for say 3 or 4 bets if he has a very strong hand as well. And then also the pre-flop action. So let me give an example there. Let's say that you have a hand like pocket tens and you flop an overpair. Well, usually that's going to be good for a minimum 3 bets, often more than that. Whereas if the pre-flop action was raise, re-raise, re-raise with some kind of massive 5-bet pot, even if you put in that much action pre-flop with the pocket tens, what that's going to mean is that everyone is expecting stronger hands post-flop. Okay, so having a decent overpair is no longer as strong in the context of all of that pre-flop action. And so we might want to take a slightly more cautious line post-flop because of all of the pre-flop action. And on the topic of caution, we have this idea of pot control. And the idea is that when you have a hand that you think is a good chance it's the best hand, you don't always want to just continue betting. A lot of the time you want to check back either the flop or the turn to limit the number of bets that will go into the pot, because if your opponent has a worse hand, it's going to be too difficult for them to pay you off if you're just betting the entire way. A lot of the time the way you want to do that is on a coordinated flop you just want to bet right then, or if you're worried about the turn card, you bet right then for equity denial and protection. Whereas if it's a dry flop, you're going to be more inclined to check back the flop for pot control and bet the turn. So let's think about an example of this. Let's say that we raise king 9 in the cutoff and both blinds call. The flop comes king queen 6. So what are we going to do in this spot? Well, we think that we have the best hand, right? We have top pair. There's no reason to think that somebody else has the best hand most of the time. But it's going to be difficult if somebody has a hand like queen 8, for example, to call us if we just go bet, bet, bet. So I would usually check back the flop here. We're not going to usually get 3 streets of value from worse hands anyway. Then we can't get check raised and face a tough spot. And we also allow people to catch up to a worse hand from a worse hand. Like let's say somebody has jack 7 suited. Well, now maybe they can hit the jack or 7 and pay us off with a bet or two. So pot control is a very useful framework we're going to use for a lot of the rest of this course. And lastly, so again, something we talk about a little bit in the book, but is so important, is don't worry if things go wrong. Things will always go wrong, or at least they always have the potential to go wrong. And the common things with planning hands are going to be somebody puts in a raise that you weren't necessarily counting on, or a really bad card comes, and that's just part of poker. It's not something that you can avoid, and even very good players, they're going to get caught off guard and just have to make difficult decisions. With that said, if your opponent puts in a raise or a terrible card comes and you're really not sure what to do, then you can just give up and live to fight another day. You can fold to that raise, you can check back that river ace, whatever it is, but often enough everything will go right, that for now at least, don't worry about passing on the very marginal spots. So let's go ahead now and apply these concepts in action and look at several hand examples. So the first example we're going to look at comes from a 3 rebuy 180 man sitting go. Everyone folds to hero in the small blind. I would normally be open limping here, raising is fine as well, and that's what hero does. And we get to a flop. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is our plan at this flop? And here the answer should be 3 bets. Okay, this is a strong hand. Blind versus blind, ranges are wide, top pair is a strong hand, and we should just be betting this hand. So my plan would be to have 3 bets go in. So here bets the flop. Great turn card for us in that it's usually not going to improve him in any way, and he gives us the flush draw in case we need it. We continue betting, which is great. And now that card that we don't necessarily love hits. So we need to ask ourselves, does this change our plan, and what are we going to do at the river? So first of all, both options do have merit. I wouldn't hate the decision to bet. It's possible that our opponent could have a 9 and pay us off, but usually I would check here. So this river card is going to make it so that it's now a lot more difficult for us to get paid off for 3 streets of value by a worse hand. This is a scare card that makes it better to bluff, but worse for value betting. So I would normally switch this from 3 bets to 2 bets, but our plan here should be to check call. We certainly shouldn't give up. There are busted draws our opponent could have, like 10-8, 10-7, King 10, stuff like that. And we'll talk more about switching to check calling at the river in the section on keys to playing the late streets. So what I like doing here is check calling this river, given that it is a scare card that's going to make it difficult for worse hands to pay us off. And we definitely maximize our chance of getting paid off considering he had a busted draw, and hero takes a very nice line in this hand. Now we're in another 3R180 spot. Check preflop, of course, with our junk hand. And so the question is, what is our plan on this flop? So this is not a quiz question, but I do want you guys to think about this. Come up with your answer, because it is a good way to informally get a pulse for how you're doing by thinking about a spot like this. And my answer here is that my plan would be to check fold, and this is a 0 bets spot. We have terrible reverse implied odds, and what I would do is hope to show down. I mean, not that hoping is going to mean too much when you're playing poker, but if we get to show down, that's great. But our hand really is not good enough to call it bad unless we improve, or possibly it gets checked to the river. So again, plan is 0 bets, check fold this flop. And here at the river, you know, our hand certainly could be best. Maybe he has some kind of hand like 7-6 suited at this point, but it's certainly not good enough to value bet. And I would also fold if he bets. But we do win the pot, which is a nice little benefit there. Another one, we're going to open with pocket aces, and we get three-way action. So here I think there are two very reasonable choices you could come up with. You could either say that you want 2 bets to go in or 3 bets. If you say 1 bet, that's too cautious. You're too worried about trips. If you say unlimited bets, that's actually not totally crazy considering that the effective stack isn't very deep. It would be crazy if the effective stack was 5,000 chips and you just wanted unlimited bets to go in. So here probably if we play for more than 3 bets, we're pretty much going to be putting our stack in. But generally speaking, at least with deeper stacks, this is going to be either 2 or 3 bets, depending on how loose your opponents are. So if these were like loose, low-stakes opponents, I'd probably go after the full 3 bets and hope that they pay me off with some kind of hand like pocket 5s or ace-3. If they're slightly better opponents, I would only go after 2 bets. And if we are only going to go after 2 bets, usually the way to go is going to be checking the flop, because that way we're not worried about somebody drawing out on us at the turn, and we allow somebody to catch up to a second best hand. So most of the time when we're ahead, we're way ahead here. And if somebody has a hand, like let's say these guys have hands like Jack 8 and King 5, okay, in that case they have a lot of combined outs to pair. They have 12 combined outs to pair, and we're happy for them to pair because that's going to allow them to pay us off with worse hands. So here does he like to bet and comes up with this sort of crafty check raise turn line, which is reasonable. We're going to talk more about this again at this turn and river section. Our opponent kind of overplays his hand here, but on balance, 2 or 3 bets is our plan at this flop. Another one with Jack 10 suited here, we elects to call this raise. Considering that it's only a min raise and we have position with deep stacks, I do like this decision to call pre-flop with the Jack 10 suited. If you folded, that's not any kind of significant mistake, but calling here is a reasonable play. My plan at this flop would be 2 bets. So here multi-way 3 bets would be too ambitious. If somebody has a hand like, you know, Queen 3 suited or pocket 7s, or worse Jack, they're probably not going to pay if we go bet, bet, bet. At the same time, this is a reasonably strong hand. More than half the time, we expect for it to be a winner among this group of 3 hands. So what I like doing here is having a plan of 2 bets going in post-flop, and I would normally check back the flop for pot control. It's not a super coordinated flop. We also have backdoor straight and flush draws. So again, I like checking back the flop here. What we're going to do then, if our opponents check the turn, we're going to bet it. And if one of them bets, we're just going to call. Here are the bets flop. As played, I would check back turn, and this is a great check back. So we're checking back now for pot control, and our plan is going to be for 1 bet to go in on the river. If our opponent bets, we're going to call, snap off any bluffs, or maybe even him value betting with some worse hands like worse Jack X hands. And if he checks, I would value bet. So I really like this line with the exception that I think the river check back is too cautious. We can go ahead and put out a bet of about 150 chips here, looking to get value from a worse hand like this one. Here we are with ace-king offsuit. And pre-flop, we are normally going to 3-bet this hand. And this goes to the idea of pre-flop hand planning. What are we going to do if we 3-bet and he puts in the 4th bet? So we make it 180 and he either shoves or makes it 540. Well, against a very tight player, that would be concerning. We'd probably have to fold. And so it's reasonable to just call pre-flop against that tighter opponent. Against a looser player or an unknown at low stakes, I would be willing to get my stack in pre-flop here with ace-king. So my default play would be to 3-bet to 180 chips, being willing to get it in against the 4-bet, and with the right read, I would not be willing to get it in, which would cause me to just call pre-flop. So what is our plan at this flop? Now you might say, okay, well, we've missed, we're just in a bluffing framework. But keep in mind that we have the best hand a real amount of the time here. It's a not super coordinated flop. We have the best possible no pair hand with our ace-king. We also have 2 backdoor draws. So this is probably good enough for one bet to go in. He can call us with some draws, with some worse ace-high hands. And my preference here is to check back this flop. It's going to prevent him from check raising us. We exercise some pot control. We benefit from the free card with their overcards and backdoor draws. So our options are, number one, we check back here and then often bet turn. Just seems like here is doing this, which is great. Alternatively, if we bet flop, our plan is to check back turn and then show down as cheaply as possible. Our opponent min bets, which is kind of like checking with a chip. If he bet 100, I would call here. When he bets 20, we might put in a raise only because this bet looks so weak. But hero calls. And now we hit top pair. So with top pair, almost no action has gone in, and we are happy for the action to go in at this point. I will go ahead and bet 150 for value. Now let's look at pocket sixes. Here we're getting significantly better than 20 to 1 implied odds. In fact, because he's betting 140, 30 to 1 implied odds will correspond to a 4,200 effective stack. So we know we're getting better than 30 to 1 implied odds. And we should call here with the pocket sixes to send mine. So at this flop, I would say probably 2 bets, considering that our opponent only beats us with a 9 or an overpair. So ideally 2 bets. If he checks, I would bet because our hand is vulnerable. We're betting for value and protection. And if he bets, we're going to call. So he bets again, and I will call again. Our hand is strong enough. I don't hate folding in this spot, but normally my plan would be to call here at the turn, and then if he fires big at the river, give him credit for having that overpair and give up then. With that said, I don't think it would be any kind of real mistake to just fold here, particularly if you're concerned your opponent is going to bet river as well. Now, spots like this are really, really important. So our plan was going to be to check back most rivers, but this looks very weak when our opponent checks. And also keep in mind that he's going to at least play the board. People hate getting bluffed out of spots like this. So I would put out a big bet and hope to get called by ace high, king high, when he's not actually strong. Usually if he did have a hand like pocket tens, he would not check this spot. He would know that you're likely to call looking for a chop, and he would bet big. So when he checks, you should be the one to bet big because you beat playing the board. So I think this river check back is a mistake. It would be correct on a lot of rivers, but here we should go ahead and value bet, and it's very likely our opponent would have called. Lastly, we're going to get to today's big quiz question. We put in an open 3 big blind raise here from UTG +1. And we're going to get called in 3 different spots, 4 different spots actually, so 5 to the flop. Question is, what is your plan and how many bets? So for example, you can say 2 bets and you want to check the flop and then bet turn and river. You can say as many bets as possible. So how many bets and what is your plan for this hand? Okay, so let's go to the answers. To the first question of how many bets, I'm going to accept a couple of answers. One of them is 3 bets, which should be my answer. Top pair, top kicker is a very strong hand. This certainly figures to be the best hand. We can definitely get plenty of value from worse hands. For example, hands like king, queen, king, jack, king 10 suited. If you said more than 3 bets, like you said unlimited, depending on your opponents, it might be slightly ambitious, but that totally works too. The only answers that are not going to get full credit are if you said 2 bets or fewer, which is simply too cautious with top pair, top kicker. And the question is, what is our plan? Our plan is to go bet, bet, bet. If an opponent raises us or we get a terrible run out like hard, we can evaluate then. But our plan at this flop is simply to go bet, bet, bet until something changes our mind. So those are the 2 answers. Let's see what hero does. He does in fact bet. Opponent calls. And he calls twice. So let's ask the question, what range do we put him on? And this range is probably going to consist of 3 hands, 3 types of hands. One would be king X hands. So this was often going to be some kind of suited worse king, like King Jack suited, King 10 suited, King 9 suited, maybe King Queen off. That's a big part of his hands. Some of the time he'll have an 8. An 8 is more likely at the flop. He might just give up the turn with an 8, but he can still certainly have some hands like 8-7 suited, 9-8 suited, or Ace-8 suited. And the last hand category would be a flush draw. Besides those 3 categories, there aren't a ton of others that make sense. So what do we want to do now at this river? I like just betting. If we check, that has the benefit that we can induce a bluff from a busted flush draw, so I don't think checking is pointless by any means. There's some merit there. But my preference is to just go ahead, continue betting. If he has a king, he's very likely to call us. If he has an 8 and he called turn, he might well call river. So I would just put out a bet of 1,500 here. Just go check, check. And this is a pretty good check against this actual hand. Probably the best chance we had to win our money from him was to get him to bluff river. So it doesn't work out, but certainly a reasonable line that hero takes. So that's going to end it for today. We did talk about some late street decisions, and that's going to be the topic of tomorrow. We're going to talk about turn and river concepts and build some with what we saw today. So another very cool topic. So anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed watching. This has been Colin Moshman for Katie Dozier and CardsChat.com with the Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days course. Thanks, and see you tomorrow.